Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Lee Dirks and I are pleased to have John King speaking here this morning. John King is invited to give a lot of talks, and he's made it very easy on those introducing him by living almost his entire life and career in two places. So John grew up and went to high school and undergraduate and graduate school in Orange County in Irvine, California. And he then joined the faculty at the University of California at Irvine, which is where I met him when I went there exactly 20 years ago. And that makes him uniquely positioned to address this issue of change, change brought about by technology, among other things, because Irvine was in his early days was not too much more than a ranch and some orange groves there in Orange County. And today, of course, there's no ranch and no orange trees left in Irvine. So he has seen change firsthand through his life there. He left a little bit before I left Irvine to come up here to go to Michigan, where he was the dean. I'll mention just two of his positions. He was dean of the Information School at a time around 2000. Was it 2000?
That's when I moved there.
Yeah, I moved there when the modern information school movement was beginning, and John was one of the key people promoting that. Lee Dirks has been a supporter of that effort over the last several years, and he then, after being dean, he then became vice provost, looking at information technology for the University of Michigan system as a whole. Looking at these very issues of what are the effects of information technology, particularly on education, but also in other fields which he'd been studying as part of his research. And he is now working on a book on this topic, and we are privileged to have one of his first presentations of some of the thoughts that he's exploring. So thank you very much, John.
Thank you, Jonathan. I am writing at least one book out of this. MIT Press says they want it, but they haven't seen it. So we'll see what happens with that. I spent the last 12 years doing university administration. Now I'm trying to sort out some of what I've learned. It would be crazy to think that in a talk that goes for an hour, you can put all the stuff that's on that title of that slide in there. It's actually probably going to be 3 books when it's done, and it's going to be one book each dealing with the 3 things that I'm going to talk about in a moment. But if you're hoping to get the answer to the question, where is this all headed? I don't have that yet, and I actually don't have a lot of hope of having that ever, because it turns out that predicting the future is a lot harder than it looks. But I'm trying to get situated on this, and let me tell you what the 2 things that are kind of governing me in this work. The first one is a story I got from Ken Arrow. He's an economist, and this was almost exactly 20 years ago, and this was at a meeting in Europe, and he told a story to a group of about 40 people that were there, and I was one of them, about his experience during the Second World War. Arrow's in his 80s, I guess now, and he was a PhD student actually during the war, and he was a very smart guy, and he was very good at math, and so he got stuck into the U.S. Army Air Force meteorology group, right? And this was at the very early days of weather modeling. Now, the Japanese had created these balloons that were pyrotechnic devices. They were trying to send them across using the prevailing winds across the Pacific Ocean and start forest fires in the Pacific Northwest. Right? It was a harebrained scheme, but it was a Japanese military scheme. And they were launching these balloons, and they were making it across the ocean and landing in, forests. I mean, typically they didn't work, but occasionally they would light a fire and it created a problem. So the American Pacific Command said, we want these Japanese balloons stopped. And so it's like, well, who knows about this? Oh, they're coming over on the wind. Let's give this to the weather group, right? So they got this weather group assignment. It's like, stop these balloons. And so the first question is, well, where are these balloons going to land? And they started building these models. And the guy who was running the group was an experienced meteorologist, from years and years of experience. This is crazy. This is stupid. Let's stop this modeling. Give me one of those balloons. Well, it turns out that there were several of them that didn't go off, and they were intact. And so he said, I want about 50 balloons made, exactly the same balloons. And so they made the balloons, and they gave them to the Flying Tigers, who were, flying over the hump from India to China, and the Chinese resistance that was fighting the Japanese. And they gave these guys the balloons, and they went to the same latitude on the Chinese coast that the Japanese were launching them from on the Japanese coast, and they let them go. And where they landed, well, that's where they're going to land, right? So, it's like, forget your models, forget your scientific analysis, your calculations, just release some balloons in the same place the Japanese do, and that's where we're going to find out where the balloons land, right? And so we're all listening to this. It's a great story from Ken Arrow. It's like, what's the punchline? He says, sometimes prediction time is equal to performance time. And so this is one of the real problems in a business of understanding complex, often ecological change, particularly socio-technical changes. Sometimes you not only don't understand it even when you finally see it happening, it's the performance time. Sometimes understanding happens way after performance time. You look back and say, oh, that's what happened, right? So we're going through that now, and a lot of what I'm doing here is tied to that effort. So let me start with the second story. When Nixon visited China in 1972, his historic opening to China, he spent most of his time talking to Zhou Enlai, which is the guy who's not Nixon in that picture. And there's this famous story of Nixon. This was 72, and right, this was the run-up to the bicentennial of the United States Declaration of Independence in 1776. So Nixon asked Zhou Enlai in English, translated by a translator into Chinese, what do you think the impact of the French Revolution is? And Zhou Enlai said, it's too early to say. So this was taken as a double dose of Oriental inscrutability and deep wisdom, right? Well, in 2011, because everybody thought it was the revolution of 1789. In 2011, this guy in the lower right, Charles Freeman, who was the diplomat who was fluent in Chinese and doing the translating, he was there. He said, oh, no, that was a mistake. In the translation, Zhou Enlai thought that we meant the student uprising of 1968, which wasn't 180 years before, it was 4 years before. And Zhou Enlai said, well, it's too early to say. Now, the question is, when is it not too early to say? And that turns out to be a hard question to answer because it depends on what you're trying to talk about. So Jonathan and I, when we were talking about my doing this, had this discussion about whether this was about epistemic infrastructure, which I wanted to talk about, or knowledge infrastructure. And Jonathan rightly pointed out, nobody's going to know what epistemic infrastructure means. Knowledge infrastructure is close enough. And I said, okay, fine. And he said, you can change it during the talk. So now I'm changing it, okay? So why epistemic versus knowledge? Well, I'm an undergraduate philosophy major. I just found out Lee was as well. So it's like, I learned this word, and God damn it, I'm using it. But there actually is an argument for it. It may or may not appear in the final text. I don't know what's going to happen. It depends on what the editors say. But epistemology is the theory or science of method and grounds of knowledge, right? It's sort of how it is that you know things. And epistemic means of relating to or relating to knowledge, right? So when I talk about epistemic infrastructure, I want to know what we know, how we came to know it, and why we trust what we know, right? This is the question that's driving this work, is knowledge infrastructure. And the gist of my argument is that when you change infrastructure, you change access. And when you change access, you change agency. So it's essentially a functionalist welfare argument, right? I mean, when you really get down to it, that's the argument that's being made here, is that there are functions that are performed by these things, particularly infrastructure. One of the functions is providing access. When you alter access, you alter agency. And sometimes you can have very big changes, and some very big changes have occurred. So this is the general shot. And what I'm interested in particular is the academy, or the organized production of ongoing knowledge. And this thing exists primarily because everybody dies, right? I mean, you have to continue to train successions of new entrants in the system, or you lose it. Systematic collecting is very tightly connected with the rise of part of the academy, which is the higher education component, which is one I've been thinking a lot about. And this crowdsourced knowledge, I think, is a big change. Now, it's not old. I mean, it's not new. It's not brand new. It's this crowdsourcing of knowledge has been going on for a long time in various forms. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But what's happening in crowdsourcing of knowledge right now as a result of things like the internet and so forth is really pretty spectacular. And I think it has big implications. The hard part is, what are they? And when people say, oh, we're going to totally change everything we've done, it's like, no, we're not. We never totally change everything we do. That doesn't happen. It's like the September 11th, 2001 changed everything. No, it didn't. I mean, remember when President Bush got up and said, don't change anything? 9/11 changed everything, but don't change anything. Go out and spend money. Right? This is how we're going to show these guys who hate freedom who we are. Travel, spend money. It's like, what? So I'm interested in the occlusion, and I'm interested in particular in how things become occluded. And ultimately, things are often not what they seem. And I want to give you some examples of this. This one struck my fancy. This is a place called Göbekli Tepe. I don't speak Turkish, so I don't really know exactly how to pronounce this. But anyway, this is an excavation, an archaeological excavation in modern-day Turkey. This is the oldest known temple in the world. And so why do I put that up there? Well, they used to think that people settled down, created agriculture, settled down, and then created religion. This thing's like 12,000 years old, right? And they can't find any village near this. And so now they're thinking, well, maybe people created religion, and then they created agriculture and settled down. Which of these is right? Well, it's too early to say. Right? It's 12,000 years ago that this happened. It's too early to say because we don't know what the archaeological record is. They actually thought this other story until they found this place. And then the guy who found this place said, well, that can't be right. Because if that was true, there would be like a village nearby. And there's not a village for like kilometers that they've been able to find. Now, maybe they'll find a village. Okay. This is a picture of the ruins of Shakshashila in the Indus Valley in modern-day India. This was probably the first university. But was it the first university? I don't know. It's too early to say, right? Because we don't have any records of that, right? Now, so people ask, well, what was the first university? Well, Plato's Academy, right? Well, we have a picture of that. Now, of course, it's not a photograph. Somebody painted it a long time later, looking back. And I would guess that particular scene never really occurred at Plato's Academy. But, we have an academic tradition that stems from Plato's Academy, and it's an important tradition. So just tell you one story about the kind of surprise that comes out of this. In classical antiquity, because Plato's Academy started about 2,500 years ago, they basically divided the world of knowledge into 7 chunks. The trivium on this side, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium on that side, which was music, astronomy, arithmetic and geometry. Now, an historic accident occurred. That stuff got destroyed in the West. The quadrivium got destroyed in the West. It was maintained by people in the Islamic world, and it found its way into the Islamic libraries. And these were the Greek texts, mind you. They were translated into Arabic, but they were original Greek texts. This stuff survived in the West. And this is what gave rise to the Academy of the late Roman Empire that was done by Cassiodorus and Boethius and people like that. It was grounded in the trivium because that's all they had. They didn't have the quadrivium. Those documents were lost to the West, right? Now, they were reintroduced to the West when the Moors, remember them? The Moors from northern Africa, the Islamic Umayyad dynasty, they took over Iberia, the Iberian Peninsula, Spain. And they colonized that, and they had an empire that lasted for several centuries there, the Umayyad dynasty. And one of the places that was very strong in the Umayyad dynasty was Toledo. Toledo had actually been the center of Visigoth learning as well. And so it had a deeply established tradition of learning. And the library, the Moorish library, the Islamic library at Toledo, was the largest library in Europe. And when the Christian forces under Ferdinand and Isabella, the same ones who sent Columbus on his way, reconquered Toledo, they captured that entire infrastructure intact. And over the next 100 years or so, all of the stuff in that library was translated into Latin and circulated in Europe. And that's why we have the academies of Europe. Now, actually, the oldest still functioning university is Al-Azhar in Cairo. That was created in 970. And Bologna was created in 1088. It's a studium generale. There's a whole story I won't go into on that. But basically, it was a med school because you had to train doctors. As ineffectuous as doctors were, they were better than nothing, right? And so Bologna actually organized around a medicinal garden. And that gets to the whole business of the infrastructure, the apparatus for learning and propagating knowledge. Francis Bacon is reputed to have written this thing called Gesta Graeorum. It was actually a play that took place in Gray's Inn in London. And in this play, there is a supplicant, essentially a straight man, who is talking to this highly learned person about what you need to become a learned person. And this is what the interlocutor says. You need a library, a garden, a stable, ponds, cabinet, and still house. And these, of course, are library, botanical gardens, zoo of some sort, aquaria, a museum, and a laboratory, right? So this in 1594 was kind of a description of what the research university of today is. And of course, a lot of then our educational production system is derived from that. I'll get to that in a minute. Now, a lot of this was stimulated by the discovery, the European, quote, discovery of the New World, because there was a lot of really strange stuff that was coming back to the UK and the continent from this age of exploration, and people didn't know what to make of it. Well, one of these people, John Tredescant, created a collection, which became known as Tredescant's Rarities. And he assembled these rarities in something called the Ark. And this was in West Lambeth, across the river from London. And his son took it over eventually, and that family became well acquainted with this much more highly educated guy. Tredescant and his son were gardeners, and they were gardeners to the royal family of the UK. And Ashmole was very closely connected to Oxford University. Ashmole eventually came into possession of this collection, and he gave it to Oxford, and that's what became the Ashmolean Museum, right? And the Ashmolean Museum is the oldest extant scientific museum on Earth, right? And a lot of what is modern about Oxford as an educational institution grew up around the Ashmolean and the Bodleian Library, right? These are both systematic collection repositories. Now, the magic didn't really begin to happen until Ashmole and another guy, a guy named Peter Mundy, produced this thing, the Museum Tredescantianum, which was a catalog of all of the things in the museum. Now, there was a movement in Europe at this time of creation of these cabinets of curiosity. It became one of the things that courts did. Paul David has a great article on this, where he talks about how there was this kind of crucial period where among the court leaders in Europe, having a really talented fool and a really talented scientist were like the hot things because they were so entertaining, right? And, you know, you think times have changed, and then you think, well, maybe not, actually. So anyway, the fact that Ashmole and Mundy created this catalog and began to distribute this stuff, this was the first crowdsourcing of knowledge. And now, this was, remember, this is, you know, many, many centuries ago now. Means of preservation were not that great. So the things that made it were things that were abiding objects, right? So the first place where this really took off was in seashells, because seashells they last a long time, right? So it wasn't the Tredescant catalog that really stirred things. It was the catalog of seashells that began to circulate among all these collectors in Europe. And they began to do compare and contrast stuff, which is kind of one of the most fundamental ways that you establish reliable knowledge. And people began correcting each other. We call it today peer review, right? What these, you know, these weren't the monarchs and the members of the royal family. These were their entertainment that they hired and kept on retainer. And it's like, I want the best shell collection. Aye, you know. So how do you know you have the best shell collection? Well, you have to look at the catalog, right? It's like, we don't have that one. We don't have that one. We don't have that one, right? So we got to go get these shells, or we won't have the best shell collection. So this is how a lot of these collections got going. So I want to shift gears here and say that this kind of raises a fundamental question when you're thinking about change in knowledge infrastructure. You think there's a raison d'etre for this stuff, right? There's a sort of a core explanation. And then you ask yourself, what's obvious? And then what's hidden? And one of the questions you have to ask yourself is the stuff I'm looking at, which is typically the obvious stuff, the important stuff, or is the really important stuff what's hidden? So I want to tell you the superficial story of education in the society, and then I'll go to the deep story, the hidden story. The superficial story is the Industrial Revolution, right? Now, it's not a minor thing. I don't mean to make light of it, but you know, this is the Erie Canal in 1825. The Erie Canal is arguably, in the United States, the discriminating point. This is when things began to tip. That 1825 was when Daniel Webster gave his famous speech on Bunker Hill, talking about there's this vast opportunity that lies before us, that, you know, the unexplored territory kind of thing. As you can see, there are draft animals pulling canal boats up the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal is what opened the Great Lakes. And the Great Lakes were the access to the interior of the country. They opened up the breadbasket of what was essentially the North American continent. And this was true for, you know, both British America, Canada, and the United States for a long period of time. But in relatively rapid succession, you know, during the same period, was growing the use of carbon energy. So this is, you know, a picture of the Newcomen engine, which was first created in 1712, and then James Watt with the steam engine. And of course, after a while, carbon energy began to be crucial in factories and transport and so forth. And, you know, not very long after, you had people painting pictures like this, you know, these foundries and stuff. And the age of iron and the age of steel came in and so forth. And when you had lots of this going on, you had environments that looked like that picture, right? Prosperous, productive, not very pleasant places to live, but that didn't matter because nobody lived for very long anyway. So, you know, and people living a lot longer is something I'll come back to in a minute. So this had begun to catch the attention of leadership, right, in the society. Because when you had something like this, you were a lot richer than people who didn't have this.
Which town was that?
This is Manchester in the UK, back in the day, when the British were leading the world in production and the British Navy was the strongest military force on earth. Well, that all began to change. In 1806, Napoleon Bonaparte, defeated the Prussians at the Battle of Jena in a single day. By the middle of the 19th century, Prussia had overtaken England as the largest industrial producer. And in 1871, the Prussian army defeated Napoleon III at the Battle of Sedan. Now, if you were a leader at the time, and remember the United States was extant at this time as the United States in the 1870s, you asked, how the hell did Prussia do that? And the answer was compulsory schooling. They were the first country in the world that said everybody, which of course meant men, everybody has to study. This is the rule, right? And it was one of the Kaisers that created this rule. And these two guys, the Humboldt brothers, Wilhelm von Humboldt and Alexander von Humboldt, were the two people who sort of created the vision of what became modern higher education. Wilhelm von Humboldt is Humboldt University in Berlin, and Alexander von Humboldt was an explorer and scientist. The Humboldt Current is named after him. And what these guys argued was, this is not something that we do just because it's a cool thing to do. This is something we do because it's essential to the welfare of the society. You have to make this investment or you won't make it in the modern age. Well, this was picked up by a couple of other guys in the United States. Justin Morrill is the guy on the right, who was the prime architect of something called the Morrill Act of 1862. And then, of course, Abe Lincoln signed it into law in 1863 before he was killed. And this Morrill Act was the Land Grant Colleges and Universities Act. And this act stipulated, have it here, a grant of land to be sold to create at least one college in every state where the leading object shall be, without excluding other scientific or classical studies, so the traditional academy is absorbed here, and including military tactics, to teach such branches of learning as are related to agriculture and the mechanics. So scientific agriculture, this was the origin of extension services, agricultural extension services, and engineering, right? Now, lots of people think the University of Michigan is a land-grant college, and of course, University of Michigan, in its typical snooty fashion, holds up its nose and says, we are the progenitor of the land-grant college. Michigan State is the land-grant college, you know.
But Cornell is a land-grant.
Well, Cornell is a land-grant college, and of course, states that started early, it's like, we got this grant, like, what do we do? Who do we pick? Because we got all these existing schools, right, to pick among. Well, Michigan Agricultural College had started in 1858, and this was passed in 1863, signed into law. So, you know, they were like, we'll do that. And the University of Michigan's like, yes, you'll do that, you know, government issue. So, you know, there was, that snootiness still exists in the institution. The other thing that happened not too long after this was Andrew Carnegie and his Carnegie Library enterprise. And these are just all pictures that you can find of Carnegie libraries. This, in fact, is the one that was built in Ann Arbor, Carnegie Library, which they decided was a historic building. It's like, no, the entire thing that is part of it is an historic building. It's a long story. But anyway, a lot of Carnegie's buddies, rich tycoons like him, said, you know, this is like stupid, Andrew, why are you doing this? And he wrote an article about why he did this and published it in 1888. And this is a very interesting comment. He says, I think it fruitful in the extreme because the library gives nothing for nothing, because it helps only those that help themselves, because it does not sap the foundation of manly independence. The important thing, the sapping of manly independence was a big issue at the time, I'm sure. Because it does not pauperize, because it stretches the hand to the aspiring and places a ladder upon which they can only ascend by doing the climbing themselves, this is not charity. This is not philanthropy. It is the people themselves helping themselves by taxing themselves. Right? So this is very much an age of enterprise sentiment. Now, what was interesting, and this is a juxtaposition here that hits systematic collecting and a whole bunch of other things. This was at a period when people who ran institutions like that were starting to think of themselves as cultural institutions. And if you talk to people who are involved in cultural institutions, the gist of their story runs something like this. Any successful society sets aside resources for culture. And that's what we are. We're cultural institutions, and we take the social surplus, part of the social surplus, and we do these important cultural things because that's what successful societies do. That's backwards. You got rich because you created those institutions. Those institutions don't follow getting rich, they precede getting rich. The library at Alexandria fell, and then Rome fell. Right? Okay, so now, I first came up with this idea when I was working with a...
The Mongols didn't have any universities.
No, but the Mongols were actually pretty straightforward in how they did what they did. It's like, we've surrounded your city, you can surrender or we'll kill you all. And, I'm sure there was a think tank somewhere. It's like, is that the best strategy? Genghis asked us to work on this, so... Now, when I first started coming up with this notion, I was working with an historian, Margaret Hedstrom. And Margaret's like, excuse me, you don't have proof that, this is how it happened. It's like, hey, who needs proof? I've decided this is how it happened, right? It's a better story for what I want to do. And she's like, you can't do this. It's not historically accurate. It's like, whatever. Well, I made a list of things that happened between, late 15th century and the early 20th century that I think are relevant to this, including the Statute of Anne, was the first copyright legislation that really had teeth. The Museum de Tritas Cantianum is here. The Carnegie Libraries are here. And, the only purpose of this, you can dwell on that at your leisure, but the purpose for creating this thing was to simply say, the societies actually in the United States and in Europe, and actually in Asia too, made a lot of investments in crucial pieces of this that came together. You can pick out one of these things and say that was the turning point. And I'm willing to listen to that. But actually, I'm much more at the moment interested in the kind of the ecological flow of what's going on here, because if you look at what happened relatively quickly following this, you had mechanized agriculture, which profoundly changed the world. When the University of Michigan was first opened in Ann Arbor, the United States was primarily an agrarian economy. We started school in the fall, and we ended in the spring so people could go home and plant and harvest crops. Hey, we still do that, right? The university is like 2 ages out of date. It's still in the agrarian age. We went through the industrial age, now we're in the information age, and we still operate as though we're in the agrarian age. That's interesting. Why do we think that's okay, right? But we do. This is the established model. And I've lived through many attempted reforms. All of them, by the way, to save money, even though they were exactly the opposite of the earlier reform, because, this is something that's very hard to change. Find a university that operates 24/7, and I'll tell you, it's not a traditional university. There are some, but they're not traditional universities. So there was mechanized agriculture. There was mass production. Henry Ford in 1907 said, the magic here is not in standardizing production and lowering the cost of producing these things. The magic is in lowering the cost and paying the workers more so the workers can buy the things. That's going to be the magic. between 1907, when the first Model T rolled off the line, and 1921, when the last Model T rolled off the line, they had reduced the price of the Model T, the cost of making the Model T, from $850 to $250. And in that time, the wages had grown, so suddenly owning a car was within the reach of almost everybody. So this was a huge, huge change. During the Second World War, the arsenal of democracy, which was largely around Detroit, they got the guts, give them more firepower, right? I mean, this was the United States' role in the Second World War was basically to be the engine through which the war of attrition could be prosecuted. And as a member of a German colonel at the Battle of Monte Cassino said to the U.S. soldiers who accepted his surrender, I ran out of shells before you ran out of tanks. It's like, yeah. This was, of course, Hiroshima. This was kind of a game changer. And so was this. This was Joe 1. This was 1948, the first successful atomic bomb detonated by the Soviets. Then Stalin pulled this out of the hat. It's basically a B-17 bomber that's been reverse engineered and renamed the Tupolev 4, the T-4. This bomber was capable of flying over the North Pole and attacking Canada and the United States with nuclear weapons. Well, the Berlin Airlift happened in 1948, and this is when the people in the West began to realize this guy Stalin was a bit much, and he really was planning to take over everything he touched. So this was the beginning of the Cold War, and science was enlisted in the Cold War. So, the guy on the left in the Time Man of the Year, Vannevar Bush, he was at MIT. He authored this famous document, Science, the Endless Frontier. This document would contain the blueprint for what became the National Science Foundation. If you want to read the document, the original full-text document, it's on the NSF website. They see it as their sort of founding legislation. Project SAGE, I wrote something for Jonathan about this several years ago. Project SAGE, nobody's heard of it now, the semi-automatic ground environment. Project SAGE produced the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, what we now call air traffic control, the Worldwide Military Command and Control System. So BMUs and WMICs are both kind of gone, but air traffic control remains. NASA's deep space tracking and their ability to track objects in orbit. The semi-automatic business research environment was SABRE, and that created the world's first airline reservation system. Because it turns out airline reservation systems, like air defense, is basically an air traffic control problem. This was George Valley's insight. And it's like, well, if you treat it as an air traffic control problem, you can solve it. And that turned out to be true. Systems management came out of this project. The programming profession came out of this project. Walt Skokie one time told me about seeing a photograph from this era of a guy with a sandwich board walking around the beach at Santa Monica, and the sandwich board said, become a computer programmer. Right? Ask me how. Right? The MIT TX2, which became the PDP-10, came out of this project, and actually the IBM System 360 came out of this project, most successful mainframe in history. Then, of course, the Russians launched Sputnik, and the United States was freaked out and launched its own satellite a little better, a little later, and then the question was whether our Germans were better than their Germans. And this was 1958, January of 1958, that Explorer was launched. And at the end of 1958, the National Defense Education Act was passed. Now, it's very important to understand the connection here, because during the Second World War, radar, nuclear weapons, etc., actually the development of early stages of human-computer interaction, the ergonomics and human factors work at Willow Run Labs, because they found out that pilots were crashing airplanes because they would hit the wrong controls, right? And it's kind of inefficient. We'd much rather have them get shot down. So the NDEA was, the national government saying, hey, we need to do something about this. What we got here isn't working right. So
in the Council of Government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. Akin to and largely responsible for the sweeping changes in our industrial military posture has been the technological revolution during recent decades. In this revolution, research has become central. It also becomes more formalized, complex, and costly. A steadily increasing share is conducted for, by, or at the direction of the federal government. The free university, historically the fountainhead of free ideas and scientific discovery, has experienced a revolution in the conduct of research. Partly because of the huge costs involved, a government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded.
Now, people in universities know the first part of that speech, the military-industrial complex. They don't know the last part of the speech, right? So this...
ARPA? You set up ARPA?
Yeah, no. So one of the things you have to do when you do this kind of work is keep digging, right? And it's not too difficult to find writings where people say, stupid Eisenhower, he gave the talk about the military-industrial complex. He created the military-industrial complex. It's like, yeah, okay, cool. I got it. So this was January, his farewell speech to the American people, January 1961, right? Kennedy had been elected. So 5 months later...
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
Or being boiled down to 3 words, shut up, old man. And, of course, then the victory lap a year later.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
So this was the shift, right? I mean, it was a crucial shift that was nailing down some decisions and realizations that were made earlier, which is, wow, this knowledge is important, right? It's important to our national welfare. It's important in all kinds of ways. So the strength of the state is, to many people, the raison d'etre of the education system. But that doesn't explain why education, as we know it, has been around for 1,000 years. The deep story of education is the story of liberation. And let's talk for a moment about this guy. This is John Henry Newman. John Henry Newman was an Anglican bishop. He became a Roman Catholic and eventually a Roman Catholic bishop and eventually a cardinal. So he's sometimes known as John Cardinal Newman. And yes, the Cardinal Newman Society drew their name from him. I can't find a lot of relationship between the Cardinal Newman Society and John Henry Newman, but they do. But the Newman Centers on university campuses are the Catholic centers that are organized for those typically secular universities. Now, he wrote a book called The Idea of a University. That he wrote it in 1852, but it was published in the United States in 1854. And his concept, he was the one who coined the concept of liberal education. Liberal education was not a political term. It was in contrast to servile education. Now, actually, this goes back to Aristotle, right? So, you can trace the roots of this notion back. But Basically, Newman's idea was liberal education lifts the person above the servile, liberates Christian virtue in service to society. That's what liberal education was for in the idea of Newman. Now, what was motivating this? What was motivating it was slavery, right? Slavery was the dominant political and moral issue in the United States and Europe in the 19th century. Nothing else came close. Temperance followed that, and suffrage followed that. But the big issue in the 19th century was slavery, because slavery was still legal in a lot of places. The British Empire outlawed the slave trade in 1807. They outlawed slavery through most of the empire in 1833. And of course, the 14th Amendment was passed in the United States in 1868, and that was the changing of the Constitution to prohibit slavery. So this book was written in 1854. Now, the subject of slavery was very tied to the creation of education in the United States. Now, this is a map showing the Union forces, the Union states, the Confederate states, the border states, and the states that were not participating in the U.S. Civil War. And I draw your attention to the states up there. Those states are just full of small, private, four-year educational institutions, almost all of which were religious when they were created. They may be secular now, but they were almost all religious when they were created. And all of them were created as abolitionist production centers. They were created to create a clergy and a laity who opposed slavery. And, you know, if you reach back into their archives, you find this. This is the big deal. If you go to the Michigan State Capitol, which is in Lansing, and you go inside, it was built in 1869. It's a shrine to the Civil War, to the Michigan participation in the Civil War. Michigan had the largest percentage of its male population in the Union Army of any state in the Union. Right? So, you know, it was like a huge thing. I mean, we can't today imagine how big this was. And Frederick Douglass, who was, of course, a very, very highly regarded African American at the time, said there's power in the human mind, but education is needed for its development. He gave the speech at Manassas in 1894. So this is the link between the strength of the society and the liberation doctrine. If you could join an apparatus, a process, by which you became essential to the strength of society, you were liberated. And it didn't matter what your birth constraints were. You could be born black, you could be born female. If you went and participated in this, you would be liberated from that. And this is, of course, what gave this enormous power, the enormous thrust, to what was known as the GI Bill, the Surface Missouri Adjustment Act of 1944. And it was the desegregation of American society began in the military through an executive order by Truman. And of course, Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 was crucial in this. And the watershed period was 1964 to 1965. Not only was the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed into law and the Voter Registration Act, but the Higher Education Act. The Higher Education Act subsumed the National Defense Education Act of 1958 in the United States. And that has to be reauthorized every 5 years. And the most recent reauthorization was the Higher Education Opportunity Act of 2010. Right? That's the most recent reconsideration, reauthorization of the American commitment to higher education. The free speech movement at Berkeley, 1964, and shortly thereafter, the rise of so-called studies movements, women's studies, black studies, Chicano studies, gay studies, etc. So this is where the liberation doctrine really has come in full flow into the university. And of course, it's a largely pluralistic model, right? It's like, well, you have to decide what member you are of this class and then affiliate with this group and declare your position. And this is something we were talking about earlier. It gets back to the diversity issue. In the 19th century, the primary role of diversity in higher education was to allow people who were not like the people in charge of the society into higher education so they could become like the people who were in charge. Now, the role of diversity is to bring people who are not like the majority in and make the place more like them, right? This is the only salient. I mean, if you go back to the Supreme Court case that Michigan won in 2004, 2003, the Grutter case, where the Supreme Court, they're about to overturn that in my opinion, but at the time they declared that use of race and ethnicity in admissions was not unconstitutional. The entire case is based on educational effectiveness. The entire case is based on the argument that if you have a more diverse group, you'll have higher educational performance. No social remediation of past wrongs, none of that stuff was in the case. It was all, we're higher education, we know what we're doing, you need to leave us alone on this because this is important. We can demonstrate that this connection is there. That's what's happened. Now, of course, this is a picture from Oberlin. This is actually the issue that the robot Shaky is in. And co-ed dorms. Wink, wink. You know what's going on, right? So the sexual revolution was happening at the time. Now it's kind of all mixed up together, right? The liberation doctrine, the strength of the state. In 1964, Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, right? And this was followed fairly quickly by people realizing that there are connections between things. So externalities of the industrial era were starting to show up, Love Canal and whatnot, Earth Day, which we just celebrated the 40th anniversary of Earth Day or whatever. Recently, it was Nixon who created the Environmental Protection Agency. That's kind of rich. People then started looking at this whole business of carbon transfer from the lithosphere into the atmosphere, and what's the relationship. In the early 90s, everybody was like completely astonished that those guys gave up, right? And nobody was more unhappy about this than the people who were making money off the Cold War in the United States. I mean, they never anticipated that these guys would give up, right? So the Berlin Wall came down. But in the meantime, in the early 90s is when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published its first report. People started getting worried about the accumulation and global warming. And then in 2002, the Larsen B ice shelf in Antarctica collapsed. This was a big deal, right? Not so much because ice shelves have never collapsed before or whatever. I mean, there was a time when there was no ice there. It's because all of the people who knew about these ice shelves thought that collapses like this could only happen over like decades. And this happened like in 3 days. It's like, we're tired of being on this shelf, so we give up. And they fell in the water, right? Now, people were like, gee, we've never seen anything like that. Is that important? So I went to Antarctica for National Research Council thing. And prior to flying down from Christchurch, New Zealand, we had a seminar with a grand old man of climate change. Well, he's a paleoclimatologist, but he was one of the first guys who started doing ice cores as a way of looking at paleoclimatology. And this guy's name is George Denton. He's a professor at the University of Maine. And so he's talking to us, and we're taking notes and stuff. And he says, most of my colleagues think that what's happening is warming. I think it's just as likely that we're going to have another glacial maximum. It's like, what? He says, well, what's happening in climate change could just as easily be a new ice age. And I'm thinking, hey, I thought you guys knew that. Right? I thought you actually knew whether it was like going to be colder or warmer. Right? I thought that's what the rap on global warming meant. And he says, no, we don't understand how any of this stuff works. And all the other climatologists around the table are like, yeah, that's true. It's like, we are so screwed. because these people who are supposed to know about this stuff, they're saying like, I don't know. All we can tell you is that we haven't seen data like the data we're seeing now. I mean, the data like this have not existed on Earth in the last 700,000 years. It's like, oh, that sounds important, but what's going to happen? Well, nothing's going to happen until something happens, right? My buddy, Paul Edwards, has just done this book with MIT Press called A Vast Machine, which is a really interesting book about the politics of climate change. He told me at one point, because I was asking him questions about this, he said, well, the best climate change modelers that I've worked with have told me that in order to get very accurate predictive models of climate change, you would have to be able to sample at a resolution of about a cubic kilometer, sample the atmosphere. And it's like, okay, how many cubic kilometers are there in the atmosphere? 4.2 billion, up to 8 kilometers, which is the so-called effective atmosphere. It's 52 billion if you go out to the Kalman limit, which is a theoretical limit. So the largest sensor network that has ever been integrated is low single-digit millions. Nothing has ever been integrated at the level of 4.2 billion sensors. And that's after you solve the problem of getting the sensors on station and keeping them there, which we don't have a clue how to do. So after he tells me this, I got back to him a couple days later and said, does that mean that we're going to be experiencing the effects of climate change before the science is accurately predicting climate change? He said, oh yeah, totally. So on this NRC committee I was on, one of the people was a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. She's a scientist at Scripps, Institution of Oceanography at San Diego. And she was on a tear about climate change deniers. And these are people who are in the same equivalence class as Holocaust deniers, right? And she was like going on, climate change deniers. And I said, let me ask you a question, Len. Do you think those people who are denying the science that you're talking about right now are going to turn to you at some point and say, save us? She stopped, and then she started laughing and said, yeah, sure. It's like, well, maybe you better start working on that, because these guys are never going to listen to you until it starts to happen. And then they're going to want you to save them. And her initial reaction was, well, that's going to be highly unfair. It's like, Earth to Lynn, that's the way it works, right? I mean, you think they're going to say, oh, we were wrong and you were right? Please accept our apology? It's like, when did that happen in your experience last time? So the 20th century brought a lot of changes, and this is one I want to kind of, this is the penultimate observation I want to make. I never hear people in higher education talk about this, but this is really important. This is the concept called the rectangularization of mortality. This appeared in a 1980 paper by Jamie Fries, as a professor at Stanford. He was not writing this about the issues that I'm concerned about. He was saying, look, medicine is really going to change, because medicine up till now has basically been keeping people from dying, and we've just about got that one licked, except for the fact that everybody still dies, right? Which is kind of a crucial point, to those who are about to die. So basically people, what's happened is you push this curve out and it becomes more and more rectangular. And so what basically happens is people are born and they live for a long time, and then they all croak at about the same time. And because quality adjusted life expectancy in the 20th century rose in most cases faster than life expectancy, and my simple heuristic for this is go in a drugstore and look for a cane. When I was a kid, you went in the drugstore, the canes were like the first thing you saw, because everybody over a certain age had a cane, because your knees and your hips went, right? Now, before I left Irvine, this was in the late 90s, I asked a guy, well, when do you want to meet about this? And he gets out his calendar, he says, I can't meet that day, I'm having a hip replacement. It's like a new alternator, right? It's like, yeah. And so there's to people who've had them, it's like, well, knees are different and hips, they take longer. It's like, we're talking about a hip replacement, a knee replacement, that it can be done is the issue, right? And of course, it can be done routinely. So, you don't find canes in the supermarket. You have to look for a cane. You have to search for a cane. You have to ask, where are your canes? And you go and they have 3 canes. And they used to have tons of them, and it was like a fashion statement. So lifespan increased by about 50%. All of course, that's added to the back end of life. So years of adulthood approximately doubled. Years of childhood, it turns out, is a pretty fixed time. So what happened is life expectancy expanded and life doubled, and years at work increased by a factor of about 1.7, statistically, right? So the idea that you would go to college and get your primary and secondary education, then your post-secondary education, and then work the rest of your life based on that, it's like, what are you thinking? People live too long for that to be meaningful before you introduce the fact that knowledge is accumulating at a very fast rate. And that sort of gets into the Hobbesian bargain that we now have. This is 2000 census data. If your higher education's in the state of Washington or anything like ours, we've been saying for a long time, well, do some simple analysis. The longer you stay in school, the more money you make. And that's a really good argument, as long as it's true. But 40% of college graduates are living with their parents right now. And tuition debt exceeds revolving credit debt in the society right now. So it's not clear what this bargain is anymore. There was a chart like this on my high school books. A local bank provided, stay in school. Look at the numbers. It's like, yeah, I get it. You stay in school longer, you make more money. But that only works as long as it's true. Plus, there's the question of who benefits from the changes. You've probably all remember Animal Farm. Animal Farm is George Orwell wrote this story, and basically the animals on this farm are all under the sort of tyrannical overlordship of this evil human, and they attack the humans and get rid of them, kill them, and they set up an animal society. And this is a picture of Napoleon the pig. The name is deliberately chosen. And Napoleon the pig is kind of smarter than the other pigs, and he comes up with a great line. All animals are created equal, but some animals are equaler than others, right? And so, Animal Farm disintegrates into an unhappy society. William Faulkner wrote a couple of novels, Sanctuary, and then a sequel to Sanctuary called Requiem for a Nun. And in this book, he has a famous quote: "The past is never dead; it's not even past." Okay, so now this is really about individual pasts and things in people's lives and so forth. But historians love this quote, So my wife works in the history department in Michigan. It's like, oh yeah, I've seen that before lots of times. It's like, yeah, I bet you have. So. The past is never dead, it's not even past. So the real question here is, how do you link what's happened in the past with what we see now? And I'm just going to click through these. Google. The majority of pictures that you see here were lifted wholesale from Google Images, right? And I like giving talks with lots of pictures because they're less boring than words. And in the past, it was kind of hard to create a talk because who has an image bank with things like this? All of those videos, the Eisenhower video and the 2 Kennedy videos, so those came off of YouTube, right? So, in the production of the course material, if that's the right way of putting this talk, this thing has had an enormous impact on what I do. At Stanford, they just had these big flipped classes, right? This class on machine learning enrolled over 100,000 people. And of course, a lot of people are running around saying, oh my God, this is it. This is the big change, higher education. It's going to be completely and profoundly changed by this, in the same way that, education was changed by TV in the 1960s. I look at this and it's like, I don't know, maybe it won't be that way. This is actually an email I got recently from the provost at Michigan, Phil Hanlon. Today, a new online educational organization called Coursera, which of course is a startup coming out of Stanford, will announce that 4 top-tier American universities will offer free, not-for-credit online courses through its website. The University of Michigan is one of those schools, right? So, the key words are top-tier Michigan, right? So in case you were wondering what the signifying here is, it's that first. We're really top tier. We're really awesome. And oh, by the way, there's this Coursera thing. And when you look down, does this mean we're going to give up what we do really well? Not at all. Of course not. We're not changing anything. We're not changing anything as a result of this humongous change. We're going to stay completely the same and do this too.
Not for credit is also.
Yeah, not for free. For free. It's like, how many people did we lose in the 20th century trying to decide whether communism is a good idea or a bad idea? Well, you kind of lose count at about 50 million, right? So here's a little prediction made by my study of the 20th century. Whatever the information economy is, it's not going to be communist. Just a little prediction, So free non-credit education is like, that's actually a business we haven't ever been in. But we think because we're really, really smart and we're the University of Michigan that we understand this, right? So one of the things that's a good idea to do is look around and ask, what's already going on that we're learning? CERN, the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, they've been in the news recently because they lit up and they're starting to find stuff. The Atlas project is one of the big projects there. These are like, standard Smithsonian humans down there. So the Atlas project is this enormous detector that's part of the 27-kilometer long ring. It's like 200 meters below the ground. It has 2,000 principal investigators. 2,000 principal investigators. And a whole lot of worker bees beyond that, right? They have had to figure out authorship. There are papers coming out of the Atlas project where the number of pages dedicated to the listing the authors is longer than the article, right? And so people will say, well, we have to deal with the authorship issue. What authorship issue? We're already dealing with a whole bunch of authorship issues, not the least of which is, remember Rosalind Franklin? Does anybody know that name? Yes. Yeah. Well, what happened to Rosalind Franklin with the Watson and Crick DNA stuff? Well, all we know for sure is that she didn't get the Nobel Prize. Could that be because she was a she? Interesting question, right? Ownership, who owns this stuff, right? We don't know. Remember Encarta? Encarta was like totally going to change everything until we killed it. But then Wikipedia came along, and Wikipedia has been growing by leaps and bounds. Now, every time you get on, there's an appeal from Jamie Wales saying, give me money. But, it's growing like Topsy. If you enter Microsoft, turns out there's a big article on Microsoft in the English version. I'm sure it's in other versions too. And one of the things you can do in Wikipedia, which you can't do in most other places, and this obviously is getting into the crowdsourcing of knowledge issues, is people debate what constitutes fact. Now, Daniel Boorstin had an interesting comment many years ago. Not Boorstin, it was one of the other guys like Boorstin. Blanking on his name right now. He said everybody's entitled to their opinions, but they're not entitled to their own facts. It's like, wrong. And all you have to do is watch the current political campaign, and you know that people are entitled to their own facts. Their opinions are facts, right? Now, this obviously is not a sustainable thing for reasons that we learned in the heyday of science advancement in the 20th century. But politically, it's a very powerful thing right now. Point of view matters. So you look at science. This is Foldit, the website. It's worth going to if you haven't been there. It started out as a protein folding crowdsourcing of capability. It's expanded well beyond that. There's a similar thing, Galaxy Zoo, which is built around the Hubble telescope. Like a lot of astronomy aficionados. eBird. There's a lot of bird watchers out there. They now drop their information about their sightings into eBird, and then this thing produces lots of crowdsourced information on migratory patterns and spottings of various kinds of birds and so forth. SETI at Home was one of the first that started doing this. So, if you go back quickly to, Atlas and CERN, and you start thinking, what happens when you now have 4 million PIs? How does the scaling work on this? Now, there are a lot of people who are saying this is the future of science, right? This is what we should be doing because there's all this ingenious brain power out there, people who are capable of doing these things. It's true. I believe that's a good argument. But we don't have a clue how to do this stuff. It's entirely new to us. Now, the rest of these slides, I'll go through them quickly. Britannica shut down their print operation just recently, and now the final run of Britannica print things are now collectible, right? So the prices have been bid up astronomically. We have all kinds of rankings. This is rankings for library and information studies. We in the iSchools look at this and say, do we fit in there? And here we are, University of Michigan, and Ann Arbor, University of Washington is ahead of us in the rankings. Oh my God. So the only thing I can say about rankings is there tends to be two responses in rankings. For those who are ranked highly, they say, oh, these rankings are garbage, but I couldn't help noticing that I'm ranked really highly. And people who are not ranked highly say, these rankings are garbage, and they leave it at that. Right, so question of who benefits is still there. This is an interesting piece. I just threw it in for the hell of it. Bibliobouts. This is something that, a gaming thing that was started actually by a donation that I got from a benefactor, and IMLS funded it. This is a thing that is used in classes to help students learn how to use online sources to determine whether information is good. Patterns, well, objects in the mirror are often closer than they appear, right? I mean, we all see this on our mirrors. But it's true. And sometimes what's behind the thing that you see in the mirror is actually more important. So I personally believe at this point that this whole issue of liberation, the relationship between knowledge and liberation, learning and liberation, is more important than the strength of the state in education. And I say that particularly in the case of the Western academic tradition, because this is deeply embedded in the Abrahamic religious traditions of Judaism, Islam, Christianity. All of them are very, very heavily invested in this notion of the relationship between liberation and learning. This, to me, is very important. I don't understand it completely yet, but I think it's very important. It's more important than Sputnik and all this other stuff. Everything important has a history, but the histories themselves are often disputed. So sometimes you can't get the history. All you can get is the disputes about the history. But those are important too, and that's a kind of history. Changing infrastructure changes access, changing access changes agency. We've seen this repeatedly, but the question of who benefits continues to rise. So the question at the end of this is, what are the causal mechanisms here? And how do they relate to design? Now, some people say, John, where you're going with this is that it's pointless to try to understand this stuff. That's not my position. It's very hard to understand this stuff, but unless you understand it, you can't design things. And if you can't design things, you can't make anything better. And I am personally not a person who thinks that there's no point in trying to make things better. I actually think making things better is a good idea. Now, whether we will make things better in time to dodge whatever bullets are coming our way is a different question. I was at it was a Festschrift / celebration of the creation of this thing at Irvine called the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae. This was the first ever complete installation of the entire corpus of an ancient language in machine-readable form. It started in 1972 at Irvine. And Bill Donahoe gave the keynote talk. He was just recently, until recently, provost at Georgetown. He's a Cassiodorus scholar. He's a Latinist, not a Greek guy, but he was talking about this. So one of the people asked him at the end of this talk was very interesting. Bill, you've been in classical scholarship for a long time. What do you think the most interesting issues for classical scholarship for the next 25 years are? And his response was, I think this climate change thing is going to be really entertaining. It's like, when I heard him say that, it's like, yeah, probably more entertaining than whatever's going on in classical scholarship, right? And after a while, you start thinking, well, can you even have classical scholarship without a climate where everybody isn't dying? So let me just close with the final observation about the iSchools. First of all, I burst out laughing when I went there because that's my old friend Les Gasser. Playing his guitar in front of information affordances, right? I mean, it's like, what are they trying to say with this picture? Now, if you don't know Les, it's just like, this was some marketing nerd's idea of a good time. But if you know Les, it's like, Les probably thinks playing that guitar is more important than that other stuff. And maybe it is. The problem with the iSchools, and this is the problem, and Mike was there at the beginning. He was on the long march along with me and some others. Is we've never really known what the iSchools should be. Now we have an arsenal of things that we tell people who think we should know, right? But one of the arguments we used to have early on was, people would say, well, we have to define what the iSchools are, and I used to say, no, that's the quickest way to kill this thing, because we don't. Not only do we not know what the iSchools are, we don't even know what they should be. My feeling is they need to be about the kind of stuff that I'm talking about in this talk. Because I know that most of the rest of the parts of the university, at least this is true of the University of Michigan, they don't care about this. They're not paying attention to this. They're not thinking about it. And they have no idea how huge the change that's upon us really is. This really is a big deal. And when people say, what do you mean by this? All I can do is gesture and say a lot, stuff like this. Right? Because, first of all, prediction time and performance time are tightly coupled in this. If I could predict the future, I'd be really, really rich. Right? That's one of the reasons why people like to be able to predict the future, is they want to get rich. I can't predict the future. I mean, I remember back when people told me, well, you really should buy a lot of stock in Microsoft. It's like, who the hell would want to do that? This was like back in the 80s, right? Or you should buy Apple, or you should buy Cisco. And it's like, no, I'd rather put my investment money into importing Kenyan mushrooms. That business actually didn't do very well. Or I'm going to invest in this competitor who's really going to kick Mrs. Fields' ass in chocolate chip cookies. Actually, she kicked our ass. So, I'm a terrible investor, this kind of thing. I'm just trying to understand what the causal connections are here. So I think that's what the iSchools movement is about. The iSchools movement is in response to this visceral feeling that there's something huge going on here in this information thing. And we don't really know what it is. We think it's important to higher education at the university. We think it's important to systematic collecting. This whole crowdsourcing of knowledge thing is a very big deal. But we don't know what to do with any of this stuff. And that's the problem. We're as iSchools, we're trying to chart a course for our own welfare in what is generally a meltdown of a lot of the historical basis of higher education in this country. Because a lot of people think it's tied to the strength of the society stuff. It's like, yeah, it is. I mean, the connections are there and they're real. But there's all this, national competitiveness and stuff. That stuff is not going to work. Right? And people are drunk on this. Academic leaders are drunk on this. They think that is that's the reason. It's like, no, it was the reason. It's a big difference between those two things. Anyway, got a few minutes to talk.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome question. So going back to the Coursera and the Udacities of the world today, what do you think their causal mechanism is? I mean, it seems like liberation maybe a little bit, but not really strength of state, kind of like you were just talking about. Is it just, I don't know, free market capitalism, or?
Well, okay, so there's this great quote by Samuel Johnson that when you see a dog walking on its hind legs, the issue is not that it's doing it well, but that it's doing it at all. Now, it loses a little bit of its flavor when you realize he was talking about women preachers, but he was onto something there. He was saying that you need to discriminate between whether the thing is good or whether it's just happening at all. And so I look at Coursera and Udacity and these other things, and the provost sort of asked me what I thought about this at Michigan, because I was ostensibly working on strategy things. And I said, it's really important that they're happening. The question of what difference it makes is too early to tell. Right? We don't know what difference this makes. I mean, it's going to be free, and it's not going to be for credit. So why are we doing this again, given that everything that you've talked about, because of the fiscal crisis university, has to do with getting money, and that the way we think we're going to do that is by giving credit? I mean, we don't know why we're doing. You know why we're doing this? Because top-tier universities are doing this, and we're one. At Princeton said they wanted in. Hey, we're Michigan. We want in too, right? So I called Scott Page. He's the first guy at Michigan who's actually done one of these things, and I asked him, Scott, he and I know each other pretty well. It's like, what the hell do you think you're doing with this? And his answer was, I don't know what I'm doing with this. That's why I'm doing it. It's like, well, that's a fair answer. So I think it's really important. I think that people who ignore it at their peril. But that doesn't mean we understand what it's about. Right? So here's the biggest dilemma in studying change. When you really want to study change, you have to really understand the things that don't change. Because all change runs on the rails of the things that don't change. Right? That's axiomatic. So what do you focus on? That's the hardest problem. What do you focus on? What do you hold constant? What are the things that you declare to be non-changing? I think my guess is this liberation thing is one of them, but I'm not. This is early days. Yeah.
So riffing on that a little bit, a lot of today's education systems you're pointing out, half emerges from agricultural schedules, and the other half comes from guilds wanting to be able to certify that everyone can do a certain thing in a certain way. Mm-hmm. And then you have a lot of high-tech corporations today, say the one that I work for, that's spending a lot of time going, I don't care whether he's got a bachelor's, a master's, a PhD, or no degree at all. I need someone who can code and can code well. Mm-hmm. So there's this great sucking sound, desperately desiring people who, for example, can code, which would seem to me to be a fantastic argument for why that you would want to have a Coursera-like thing. And perhaps what you're seeing is some of the old, the agricultural pieces sort of being shrugged off. Now, how Michigan makes a buck on this is a fantastic question. I have no idea.
Yeah, and it's important to Michigan, and parenthetically important to me. But first of all, I think that there is some important set of implications between the existence proof of Coursera and this phenomenon that you're raising, which is essentially a breakdown in presumptions about credentialing, right? That's a very fundamental issue. Because if you look at what we have historically offered at the University of Michigan, and we're not unlike a lot of other places, we offer a credential. We testify that you are a thing. We call it graduate of our institution. And this carries a lot of symbolic as well as substantive weight. But let's suppose, just for the hell of it, that there was a substitute for that. What would that mean for us? Actually, that's important for us. What people are saying right now is, oh yes, substitutes for this are coming. And then you get back to, well, what do you mean by this? So when I was dean and vice provost, I used to go to the honors or the opening convocation every year. This is where all the university leadership meet the incoming freshmen. And there was a pretty standard routine to this performance, starting with, you guys are so awesome to have gotten into the University of Michigan. Well, let me tell you, this is a crowd pleaser, because a lot of them are there with their parents, and they already know they're awesome. So having you say they're awesome, they're right there. And then there's no talk about what the Academy offers. It's like the football game this Saturday. And the students are like, the football game. It's like, University of Phoenix has the stadium. They just got rid of having all the teams, you know? You know, it's like, now that is a postmodern move, yeah? You know, Phoenix used to be accredited by the ACICS, the American Council of Independent Colleges and Schools. They're now accredited by the North Central Association of Colleges and Schools Higher Learning Commission, the same outfit that accredits the University of Michigan. Why did they do that? It's not because they are so stupid. It's because they're really smart. They're coming after us. You know, a lot of people think University of Phoenix is mostly online education. They're not. University of Phoenix is almost entirely face-to-face education. But that doesn't mean they don't use IT, right? If you go into Walmart, you don't see a lot of IT. It's not like Amazon, right? And you think, well, there's e-tailing and then there's Walmart. No, Walmart is also built its fortune on IT. Supply chain management is the thing they invested heavily in, logistics. Walmart was the only outfit that had their head screwed on with Hurricane Katrina. It's like, what do you need when you have a big hurricane? Drinkable water. Do we have that? Yeah. Yeah, we have a lot of it. Well, let's put a bunch of it in trucks and start driving toward New Orleans. They did, right? And when they got there, FEMA's like, turn around and go back. We don't need your help. Now, I'm not a huge fan of Walmart, but they had trucks loaded with water heading for New Orleans. It's kind of smart, you know, it's because of their supply chain management knowledge. And FEMA turned them around and made them go the other way. It was part of the heck of a job Brownie was doing. So, you know, it's like, this seems somehow broken. I think it is. It's broken, yeah.
Well, who's sweating harder right now about Coursera? University of Phoenix, who doesn't offer the teams in the stadium, or University of Michigan, which at least gives you the Ivy? And the Brown.
Well, I'll answer the intermediate question. Who's thinking harder about it? And I can guarantee you Phoenix is. Now, who's worried more about it? That might be correlated with who's thinking about it. At the University of Michigan, we are a top-tier university. And that is all you really need to know. Yeah.
More about UDASI, because I think in the last month, I've directed 4 friends of mine to UDASI. Because just in conversation, they're like, I really feel like I need to learn more about coding, so I'm going to take a PC&E course for, you know, $2,400 bucks. I'm like, it's free. You know, get on here and do this. And they all love it. And I think that the credentialing it's going to matter. Even of Udacity, just the self-credentialing of it. If I can put on my resume, I did a course on Udacity and I scored 97th percentile of 90,000 people, you know, that counts. To anyone who looks at that is going to say, all right, you know how to do this stuff. And that's credentialing, you know, and that's going to matter.
So the University of Michigan Engineering College accepts no test scores from applicants from China unless they took exams proctored by University of Michigan people. And the reason, and I raise that because you can claim anything. The question is whether it's verifiable, right? And so these people come in with these astronomically high SAT scores, and it's completely fictitious.
But that's for a university, but for a job applicant, you know, they're going to look at that and say, all right, write me some code, let's see it. And you do it on the spot, and you're like, all right.
Well, you just added a very interesting additional dimension, which is a performative dimension, right? And Jonathan and I were talking about this the other night. I mean, how often do you run into these cases where these people say, oh yeah, I got a degree from so-and-so? They didn't, you know. I mean, this is an easy thing to check. You know, you call up the institution, did so-and-so get a degree? No, we don't have any record that that person was ever here. You know, it's like, so you lied about this? Yeah. So we have to fire your ass, right? Yeah. They fire him. And I mean, you know, it's like, This is pretty easy to check. It's actually pretty easy to check if people know how to remove an object from a linked list. You give them a linked list and ask them to remove the object. And they can either do it or they can't. Now, if what you need is people who can insert and remove objects from linked lists, this is a pretty straightforward thing. If you're hiring them to decide where the company should go, that's a little harder. We don't actually have the tests for that. So, this is one of the dilemmas of my job. I'm ostensibly advising the university on strategic issues. I'm doing this less now that I no longer am vice provost for strategy, but they still ask me what I think. And my answers very often are of the flavor, yeah, that's like a really big one. And they're like, you're supposed to tell us what to do. Well, how the hell do I know what to do? And of course, the thing that I don't say is, and for that matter, how the hell do you know what to do? But they're in charge, which means they know what to do, which is why they're asking me what they should do. Right? It's easy to make light of it, right? But it's actually a very tough thing because, how many of you accurately prevented or predicted the end of the Cold War? And if anybody raised their hand and said, oh, I did, it's like, you're a liar.
There was somebody on a talk show in the UK who said, oh, of course, communism will fall. And sorry, I didn't catch what you said. And it was the number of telephones. And once you get enough telephones, the information can get about the West.
Yeah.
And that's why he was very pessimistic about China, because Tiananmen Square, if you lived, a quarter of a mile, you didn't know what went on. But in Soviet Union, ultimately, information flowed.
So there
was one guy.
There are actually a small number of people who wrote down, why this won't work, why it'll break. One of them was Hayek, Friedrich Hayek. And he came up with this thing called the local distant knowledge problem. And basically what he said is that as a general rule, the quality of decisions declines as a function of the distance between the problem and the decision maker. It's like, so central planning, that can't work. And guess what? It doesn't. Back when I was in my early stage of my academic career at Irvine, we were studying computers and city governments. The only people in the entire world who cared about this were city Soviets. They thought computers would save their ass. They would come over, they were like, actually, one of my colleagues went and visited, and this guy had our working papers in a safe in his office. He was like doling them out for favors and stuff. It's like, we can't even get this shit published, right? So.
But I do have a question, right?
Yeah.
You have iSchools up there.
Yeah.
So the University of Phoenix, as far as I know, doesn't have a library. So what's the purpose of a research library in a modern university?
Gee, that's a really good question. It turns out that I have been lately getting requests from headhunters about whether I want to be university librarian at institutions like Yale. Right? And it's like, is this a prank call? Or you get the wrong number. No, this is John King, you blah, blah, blah. It's like, yeah, I'm that guy. Some higher education leaders think, and I think they're right, that the academic library needs to be the center of a set of really important changes that happen in the academy. And when you go in and you talk to people in the academic library, they're like, we do this. Why do you do that? Because that's the kind of thing we do. And why do you do that? Because it's the kind of thing that needs to be done. Right? And it's like, oh, okay, I get it. You're defending what you've been doing all this time. So when we were searching for university librarian, I recommended Paul Courant and badgered the hell out of him until he took the job. Now, he was the former provost, he was an economist. And, he came in and, Paul's actually pretty good with people, and he started saying, we're going to have to destroy Carthage, at some point. And, after I repeated it enough times, people were saying, like, what about Carthage? What are we going to do about Carthage? Should we destroy it? And, so now they're talking seriously about getting hundreds of thousands, if not millions of volumes out of the building because they're, like, online. Like, why are we storing them in the building? And, you know, at the other end, there's the ARL. You know, and the ARL is like, we rank you by your metric tonnage of cellulose. Right? And our only criterion is that every piece of cellulose has to have a different title. Right? And so the librarians were like, oh my God, we're going to fall on the ARL rankings. It's like, yeah, we probably will. It doesn't really matter very much. It's like, those are the only rankings we have. Yeah.
I mean, you know, using that as an example, is it possible that metrics can reverse themselves?
Of course, of course. And what's difficult to predict is when and how that will happen. Right? I mean, when people say, well, haven't you been surprised before? My answer is, yes, of course I've been surprised before. I mean, you know, when people say, well, you know, I went to the, I was telling Jonathan about this, the National Computer Conference or the Fall Joint Computer Conference, whatever it was. It was the Anaheim Convention Center in 1988, 78. And there was a booth, the Apple booth. And Jobs and Wozniak were both there in this booth, right? And they were like, you know, hey, people want computers. What? Nobody wants a computer. Well, I didn't get rich on the personal computer industry, right? I was getting funded by IBM. I was listening to the guys at IBM. It's like, nobody wants these things. It's like, actually they do, right? The rest is now history. So, yeah, really big change can happen. The problem is predicting it, getting it right. And that's kind of the job I'm working on.
Okay, John will be happy to answer questions. It's 10 past 12, so I think why don't we thank John again if people have questions.